The rain fell in sheets, a relentless downpour that turned the ground into a muddy quagmire. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches like desperate hands reaching for salvation. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a low growl that seemed to echo the unease of the night. It was the kind of storm that made people stay indoors, huddled under blankets, safe from the chaos outside. But not everyone had that luxury. In the shadow of a sprawling estate, hidden behind a wrought-iron gate that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, something moved. A figure, low to the ground, limped through the rain. It was a dog, a German shepherd, his once proud frame now reduced to a gaunt silhouette. His fur was matted, caked with mud, and something darker, something that looked suspiciously like dried. Blood. His ribs protruded sharply beneath his skin, and his eyes, wide, terrified, and darting, told a story of unimaginable suffering. He stumbled, collapsing into a ditch that ran alongside the estate's perimeter. The water pooled around him, turning the ditch into a shallow river, but he didn't move. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal: fear. He pressed himself into the mud, as if trying to disappear, to become one with the earth. His ears twitched at every sound: the rustle of leaves, the creak of a tree branch, the distant hum of a car engine. Each noise made him flinch, his breath hitching in his chest. But why was he here? This wasn't just any estate. This was the home of Jeff Bezos, one of the most powerful men in the world. A fortress of wealth and security, a place where no stray dog should ever wander. And yet, here he was, crawling through the mud, his eyes fixed on the mansion's glowing windows, like they held the promise of salvation. Or perhaps like they held the key to a mystery far darker than anyone could imagine. The dog let out a low whine, a sound so full of pain and desperation that it cut through the storm like a knife. And then, as if sensing he was being watched, he turned his head, his eyes locking onto something or someone in the distance. His body went rigid, his hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in his throat, but it was weak, more fear than threat. Who was watching him? And why did the dog look so terrified? The figure watching the dog wasn't a security guard or a passerby. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn in the dim light of her flashlight. Her name was Claire, and she wasn't supposed to be here. She was a freelance journalist, working on a piece about the growing wealth gap in Seattle. She'd been driving past the estate when she'd seen the dog, or rather the shadow of the dog, limping through the rain. Something about him had made her stop, something that went beyond curiosity. Now, crouched in the mud, her heart pounding in her chest, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. The dog was clearly injured, maybe even dying, but there was something else, something off. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd growled. It wasn't just fear. It was recognition, like he knew something she didn't. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The dog didn't move. His eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, his body tense. Claire took a slow step forward, her boots sinking into the mud. She held out her hand, palm up, a universal gesture of peace. But the dog didn't respond. Instead, he let out another low whine, his body trembling even harder. "You're safe now," she said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "I'm going to help you." She took another step, and that's when she saw it. The dog's collar, or what was left of it. It was a thick leather band, but it had been mutilated, the edges frayed and torn. There was a tag, but the name had been scratched out, leaving only a few jagged letters that were impossible to read. And then there were the scars. They crisscrossed. His body, some old and faded, others fresh and raw. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. What had this poor animal been through? She reached out again, this time closer, her fingers brushing against the dog's fur. He flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement that made her pull her hand back, but she didn't give up. She couldn't. Not now. It's okay, she repeated, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. I'm here to help. The dog's eyes flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw something, a glimmer of hope maybe, or trust. But then he turned his head, his gaze shifting to something behind her. Claire froze. She hadn't heard anything, but the dog's reaction was unmistakable. His body went rigid, his ears flattening against his head. A low growl escaped his throat, but this time it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the darkness behind her. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her flashlight cutting through the rain. The beam of light swept across the trees, the fence, the muddy ground. For a moment, she saw nothing. And then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw it. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading away from the ditch and into the woods. Someone had been here. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Claire's mind raced as she stared at the footprints. They were large, made by heavy boots, and they led away from the ditch in a straight line, as if whoever had made them had been in a hurry. She glanced back at the dog, who was still trembling, his eyes fixed on the woods. He knew something. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way his body tensed at every sound. "Who was here?" she whispered, more to herself than to the dog. "What happened to you?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but Claire didn't need him to. The evidence was all around her. The mutilated collar, the scars, the footprints, it all pointed to something sinister, something that went beyond a simple case of animal neglect. She knelt beside the dog, her mind working overtime. She needed to get him out of here. But she also needed answers. Who had done this to him, and why had he been left here of all places? It didn't make sense. Jeff Bezos' estate was one of the most secure properties in the area. No one could just wander in and dump a dog, unless they had a reason. Claire's stomach churned at the thought. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces were starting to come together. The dog's injuries, the mutilated collar, the footprints, it all pointed to one thing: abuse. And not just any abuse. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had wanted to hurt this dog. Someone had wanted to break him. But why? She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bag of treats she always carried for her own dog. She held one out to the German shepherd, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The dog's nose twitched, and for a moment she thought he might take it. But then he pulled back, his body tensing again. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe now." She placed the treat on the ground in front of him and took a step back, giving him space. The dog hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and the treat, and then, slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward and took it. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give Claire hope. She reached into her bag and pulled out a water bottle, pouring some into her cupped hand. The dog watched her, his eyes wary, but when she held her hand out, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned forward and lapped at the water, his movements slow and deliberate. It was the first sign of trust he'd shown, and it made Claire's heart ache. But even as she watched him drink, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The footprints were still fresh, and the dog's reaction had been too strong to ignore. Someone had been here. Someone who didn't want to be seen, and Claire had a sinking feeling that they weren't done yet. The dog finished drinking, his tongue flicking out to catch the last drops of water from Claire's hand. For a moment, the tension in his body seemed to ease, his trembling subsiding into a faint shiver. Claire allowed herself a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She was still too on edge, too aware of the footprints leading into the woods and the lingering sense that they were being watched. "We need to get out of here," she murmured, more to herself than to the dog. She glanced around, her flashlight cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. The estate loomed behind her, its windows glowing like unblinking eyes. The woods ahead were a wall of shadows, dense and impenetrable. She didn't like the idea of going back the way she'd come, not with the dog in this condition, but the alternative was even less appealing. As if sensing her unease, the dog let out a low whine, his ears twitching. Claire turned to him, her heart aching at the sight of his matted fur and hollow eyes. She couldn't leave him here, not like this. "Come on," she said softly, holding out her hand again. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The dog hesitated, his gaze flicking between her and the woods. And then, just as Claire was about to take a step forward, he froze. His body went rigid, his ears flattening against his head. A low growl rumbled in his throat, but this time it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the woods. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her flashlight sweeping across the trees. At first she saw nothing, just the endless stretch of rain and shadows. But then, just as she was about to turn back, she heard it. A twig snapped. The sound was faint, almost drowned, out by the storm, but it was enough to make Claire's heart skip a beat. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The dog's growl grew louder, more insistent, his body pressed low to the ground. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and the dog's low growl. And then, just as she was about to turn and run, she saw it. A figure. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible through the trees. But as Claire's flashlight swept across the woods, the figure came into focus. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. He stood perfectly still, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his posture relaxed, but somehow menacing. Claire's stomach churned. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't supposed to be here. "Hey!" she called out, her voice stronger this time. "What are you doing here?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching her, his face hidden in shadow. Claire's grip tightened on her flashlight, her mind racing. She needed to get out of here now, but the dog was still crouched in the ditch, his body trembling with fear. "Come on," she whispered, crouching down beside him. "We need to go." The dog didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the man in the woods, his growl growing louder. Claire reached out, her hand brushing against his fur, and this time he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his body pressing against her leg. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to give Claire the courage she needed. She stood up, her flashlight still trained on the man in the woods. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm calling the police." For a moment, the man didn't move, and then, slowly, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. Claire watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just some random passerby. He had been watching them. Claire turned back to the dog, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She needed to call for help. But before she could dial, the dog let out a sharp bark, his body tensing again. Claire froze, her eyes darting back to the woods. The man was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. And then, as if to confirm her fears, she heard it. The sound of an engine. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it was growing louder. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the road that ran alongside the estate. In the distance, she saw the glow of headlights cutting through the rain. Someone was coming. "We need to go," she whispered, crouching down beside the dog again. "Now!" The dog didn't argue. He let out a low whine, his body pressing against her leg as she scooped him up. He was heavier than she'd expected, his body solid despite his emaciated frame. But she didn't care. She couldn't leave him here. Not with that man in the woods. not with whoever was coming. She stumbled through the mud, her boots slipping, on the wet ground, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The headlights were getting closer, the sound of the engine growing louder with every passing second. She didn't know who was in that car, but she had a feeling it wasn't someone who wanted to help. She reached her car, her hands fumbling with the keys as she tried to unlock the door. The dog whined again, his body trembling in her arms, but she didn't let go. She couldn't. Finally, the door clicked open, and she slid inside, the dog collapsing onto the passenger seat beside her. She didn't waste any time. She turned the key in the ignition, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, and she slammed her foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the mud before catching traction. The car shot forward, the headlights, cutting through the rain as she sped away from the estate. In the rearview mirror, she saw the other car pull up to the spot where she'd found the dog. It was a black SUV, its windows tinted, its engine idling. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she watched it, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Who were they? And what did they want with the dog? She didn't know. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. The drive back to Claire's apartment was a blur. The rain continued to pour, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the glass clear. The dog sat in the passenger seat, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He didn't make a sound, but Claire could feel his fear radiating off him in waves. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You're safe now." The dog didn't respond. He just sat there, his body tense, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Claire didn't blame him. She was just as on edge, her heart still pounding from the encounter at the estate. When they finally reached her apartment, Claire parked the car and turned to the dog. He was still trembling, his body pressed against the door like he was trying to disappear. "Come on," she said gently, reaching out to him. "Let's get you inside." The dog hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and the door, and then slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward and let her help him out of the car. He stumbled as his paws hit the ground, his legs shaky and weak, but Claire was there to steady him. "You're okay," she whispered, her hand brushing against his fur. "I've got you." She led him up the stairs to her apartment, her heart aching at the sight of his emaciated frame. He was so thin, so fragile, but there was a strength in him that she couldn't ignore. He was a survivor. She could see it in his eyes. When they reached her apartment, Claire opened the door and ushered him inside. The dog hesitated at the threshold, his body tense, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space, but then slowly he stepped inside, his tail tucked between his legs. Claire closed the door behind him, her heart aching at the sight of him standing there, so lost and afraid. She grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it over him, her hands gentle as she smoothed it over his trembling body. "You're safe here," she said softly, crouching down beside him. "No one's going to hurt you." The dog looked at her, his eyes wide and uncertain, and then slowly he leaned into her touch, his body pressing against her leg. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make Claire's heart swell with emotion. She reached out and gently scratched behind his ears, her touch light and soothing. The dog let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing slightly under her hand. It was the first time she'd seen him truly relax, and it filled her with a sense of hope. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I promise." The dog didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The way he leaned into her touch, the way his body relaxed under her hand, it was enough. For the first time since she'd found him, Claire felt like they were going to be okay. But even as she sat there, her hand resting on the dog's head, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of the woods yet. Whoever had been at the estate, whoever was in that black SUV, they weren't going to give up that easily. and Claire had a feeling that the dog's past was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Claire's apartment was a small, cozy space, filled with the warm glow of lamplight and the faint scent of lavender from a candle burning on the coffee table. It was a stark contrast to the storm raging outside, a safe haven from the chaos they'd just escaped. The dog stood in the middle of the living room, his body still trembling, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. He looked so out of place, so fragile that it made Claire's heart ache. "It's okay," she said softly, crouching down beside him. "You're safe here." The dog didn't respond. He just stood there, his tail tucked between his legs, his body tense. Claire reached out and gently placed a hand on his back, her touch light and reassuring. He flinched at first, but then slowly he leaned into her touch, his body relaxing slightly. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said, standing up and heading to the bathroom. She grabbed a towel and a bowl of warm water, her hands trembling. As she carried them back to the living room, the dog watched her warily, his eyes following her every move. But he didn't pull away when she knelt beside him. She started with his face, gently wiping away the mud and grime that clung to his fur. The dog flinched at first, his body tensing, but then he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as she worked. Claire's heart ached at the sight of him, so broken and yet so trusting. She didn't know what he'd been through, but she was, determined to help him heal. As she worked, she noticed more scars, old wounds that had healed poorly, fresh cuts that were still raw and angry. Her hands shook as she traced the lines of his injuries, her mind racing with questions. Who had done this to him? And why? When she was done, she draped the towel over him and sat back, her heart heavy with emotion. The dog looked at her, his eyes wide and uncertain, and for a moment Claire thought she saw something, a glimmer of gratitude maybe, or trust. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I promise." The dog didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The way he looked at her, the way he leaned into her touch, it was enough. For the first time since she'd found him, Claire felt like they were going to be okay. But even as she sat there, her hand resting on the dog's head, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of the woods yet. Whoever had been at the estate, whoever was in that black SUV, they weren't going to give up that easily. And Claire had a feeling that the dog's past was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The days that followed were a blur of vet visits, sleepless nights, and slow, tentative progress. Claire named the dog Max, a simple name that felt right for him. He was still skittish, still prone to flinching at sudden movements or loud noises, but he was starting to trust her. It was a slow process, but every small victory, a wag of his tail, a lick of her hand, felt like a triumph. Claire's apartment became a sanctuary for Max. She cleared out a corner of the living room and filled it with soft blankets, toys, and a bed that he eventually started using. At first, he would only sleep in the farthest corner of the room, his body pressed against the wall as if he were trying to disappear. But as the days passed, he began to venture out, his movements cautious but curious. One night, as Claire sat on the couch with a book in her lap, Max padded over to her. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between her and the couch, and then slowly he jumped up beside her. Claire's heart swelled with emotion as he curled up next to her, his body warm and solid against her leg. "You're safe now," she whispered, her hand resting on his head. "I've got you." Max let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing under her touch. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make Claire's heart ache with love for him. He was a survivor, and she was determined to give him the life he deserved. But even as she sat there, her hand resting on Max's head, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of the woods yet. Whoever had hurt him, whoever was, In that black SUV, they weren't going to give up that easily, and Claire had a feeling that Max's past was far darker than she could have ever imagined. One night, Claire was woken by a sound, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down her spine. She sat up, her heart pounding, and turned to see Max thrashing in his sleep. His body was tense, his legs kicking out as if he were running from something. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound so full of pain and fear that it made Claire's heart ache. "Max," she whispered, reaching out to him. "It's okay. You're safe now." Max's eyes snapped open, his body jerking awake. For a moment he looked around the room, his eyes wide and terrified, and then he saw Claire. His body relaxed slightly, his tail giving a tentative wag. "It's okay," she said again, her voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe here." Max let out a soft sigh, his body pressing against her leg. Claire reached out and gently scratched behind his ears, her touch light and soothing. For the first time, Max didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his body relaxing under her hand. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make Claire's heart swell with emotion. Max was starting to trust her, to feel safe with her, and that was all she could ask for. As the days passed, Claire began to piece together Max's past. She found an old news article about a dog fighting ring that had been busted in the area, and her heart ached at the thought of what Max had endured. But even as she read the article, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Who had hurt Max? And why had he been left at Jeff Bezos' estate? Claire didn't have the answers, but she was determined to find them. Max was a survivor, and she was going to make sure he got the justice he deserved. As she sat there, her hand resting on Max's head, she felt a sense of hope. They had a long road ahead of them, but they were in it together, and that was enough. "Whoever did this," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "they weren't expecting him to survive." And with that, Claire and Max began their journey toward healing, one small step at a time.